This is BrainSTEM with your host, neuroscientist Dr. Hilary Marusak, production by Amanpreet Manmeet Bhogal. All right, hello. Welcome to our episode on psychedelics. I have two amazing therapists, researchers here. I'm so excited to talk to you both. Can you both start by just briefly introducing yourselves?
Sure, I'll start us off. So I'm Sarah Reed, a licensed marriage and family therapist, also CEO of Mind's Eye Health Solutions, which is a mental health and tech service company that is dedicated to changing how we talk about and treat mental illness. And I am super grateful to be here. I hold a lot of different hats in my daytime, like lover, like daughter, like plant lover, and human. And I am very grateful to be here with you all today and hope to be able to share some meaningful information and share a little bit about the work that it is that I do.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Jamila George. I'm actually an advanced clinical psychology PhD student. I reign from the great city of Detroit, Michigan, which I like to acknowledge as the ancestral home of the Ojibwe and Ottawa and Potawatomi tribes. Um, I am a researcher, clinician, therapist, daughter, friend, singer, dancer, activist, all of the things. And so happy to be here today. Really excited about this opportunity.
Both of you are way more creative than myself. Ask my students. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to get into this topic. It seems like we're hearing about the psychedelic renaissance, psychedelics for treatment of various mental disorders, anxiety, depression, PTSD. So can you just start by telling us how we got to this point?
hmm So, what feels important to me about the origin stories of medicine work is to honor the um, indigenous folks that we've drawn practices from, that we've drawn wisdom from, because
Mhm.
the reality is the psychedelic medicine field would not exist if it weren't for the wisdom and the practices of indigenous folks. And Jamila actually co-wrote a wonderful paper on this topic, which I'm sure she can speak more to around its origins.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the plug, sis. So Sarah's referring to a paper that I co-wrote with a couple colleagues. It's titled "The Psychedelic Renaissance and the Limitations of a White Dominant Medical Framework." And it's a call for Indigenous and ethnic minority inclusion. And it's highlighting exactly what Sarah just mentioned. It's this idea that a lot of times we tend to credit uh, scholars, chemists, researchers in the United States, starting in the mid 1950s to kind of the earliest kind of credits for folks like Dr. Hoffman, who get credit for their contributions in synthesizing um,
Mhm.
kind of LSD, for example. And the reality is that we have to, if we want to be accurate in our historical timeline of these medicines, we have to go back thousands of years
Right.
and really give credit and give homage to the peoples from indigenous lands and communities who and many times sacrifice their lives to test out these different plants for different ways of healing their bodies or healing their minds in community or religious settings to kind of try to connect with the divine, right? So there's a lot of rich history that I think tends to get kind of whitewashed and minimized and marginalized from this narrative. So it's really important that we that we take those things into consideration and not exclude the folks for whom, if it weren't for their lives, their sacrifice, their practice, their wisdom, we would not be here.
Yes, and their protection of the plant medicines too. Just
Yes.
because if indigenous folks haven't didn't protect the plants, then the Westerners wouldn't be able to study the plants, to study medicine work in the ways that they are able to do today. So,
Mhm.
with starting with indigenous wisdom, indigenous practices, and kind of bringing it to now. So psychedelics is kind of a catch-all phrase for these altering substances or conscious expanding substances that really allows folks to, or it may allow folks to really engage with their emotional wounds in a different way, traumatic
Mhm.
wounds in a different way. And so, what's being studied right now, you might have the classical psychedelics um, like mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, um, DMT, but you also have the other psychedelics like MDMA, ketamine is even considered a psychedelic
Mhm.
in context of this conversation around medicine work. So there are all kinds of research studies that are happening now around the safety and the efficacy of these substances, and we just happen to be two therapists who have had opportunities to work with them.
Yeah, that was a
And you
wonderful. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, sorry. I was just going to add one more thing that I think is important to kind of tag on to what Sarah is mentioning, that we kind of understand these kind of, hallucinogenic drugs as being able to alter states of consciousness, right? And kind of channeling the serotonin to a receptor agonism, for example, for kind of enhanced sensory perception, thought processes, energy levels. Spiritual experiences for some folks just for fun. Um, the reality is that these medicines a lot of them come from a sacred context
Mhm.
in which it's important to understand before we really are utilizing them in such a way. And that modern chemistry has really, in a lot of ways, been able to kind of duplicate some of these substances or even kind of manipulate the chemical structures to really kind of, mimic this synthetic form. But the reality is, many of these hallucinogens have origins in plants. So it's just so important to pay homage to the land, to the people, and to the plants that are even informing the synergetic kind of experiences that come from psychedelics.
Absolutely. And Sarah, if you're watching on the video, actually has a plant to her right. So it's a perfect addition. I love that historical context. And thank you both so much for bringing that, because I think there's so much interest in this right now. And finally, we've been able to apply, medical research to address this area. But like you pointed out, people have been using these things for millennia. And we need to understand that that is the reality of it, and that is part of the history of this. So thank you so much for doing that. And I want to be clear, what you guys are doing is not just asking people to go out and do mushrooms. You're doing it in the context of a very well-defined clinical treatment program. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to walk us through what that actually looks like from your perspective and from the patient's perspective as well.
Yes. So thank you so much for talking about just the importance of the container or the setting of which really holds this medicine work, because the reality is, as psychedelics go mainstream, there are folks who are getting exposed to psychedelics through different media, whether it's documentaries, whether it's things on social media platforms, and the like. And folks are curious about experimenting with them in the comfort of their home. And, sometimes there might even be folks who are interested in receiving the treatment in a medicalized context. They go to treatment or go to a therapist that offers, say, for example, ketamine therapy, and they are hopeful about the treatment. But then when they hear that price, they're like, yes, so I, want this treatment, but the way that my bank account is set up, I don't think that, we can pursue this. So, what are my options? And I think that this is a really important question for therapists to consider, for clinicians to consider, for the psychedelic medicine field at large should consider, because we are in this moment right now, especially with COVID. There's been some self-reports that have come out where folks are using more substance recreationally. And to me, it's really important to think about how do we reduce the harms against mind, body, spirit as psychedelics go mainstream. So I just wanted to name that point before talking about the medicalized setting, just to let folks know that there are online resources available for integration therapy. So if folks are having the experiences outside of a medicalized context, but need to integrate their experiences, is help available, that you do not have to go through this alone. Period.
Yes.
So with that, let me go back to psychedelic therapy and what it is. So psychedelics are used as an adjunct to psychotherapy to help people resolve emotional wounds of the past, experience past traumatic experiences, resolve things like anxiety, depression. And in the context, I'll speak for MDMA therapy, for example. A participant who enrolls in a study is going to sit with two therapists and completes a series of both drug and non-drug treatment sessions where they are really tackling this material in a very new way, in a very new container. As Jamila was saying earlier, it's not just about the effects of the drug that really that can catalyze this change. It's the synergy between the drug, the therapist, the participants, spirit, the environment that a person in. It's the synergy of all of these pieces that work together for the healing. And to me, that is what psychedelic therapy is.
Yeah.
That was beautiful.
I know I forgot something.
No, I mean, yeah, you absolutely, you hit it right on the head. Setting. Kind of, I think one thing I do want to highlight is that some people tend to think that like psychedelic assisted therapy, they take out the assisted therapy part and they focus on the psychedelic. And it's like, yes, you're going to take this this plant-based medicine or this psychoactive drug, but you're also going to endure 8 hours. If you're doing MDMA, for example, you're going to be in an 8-hour session with two therapists whereby you have to really confront a lot of the fear and the trauma and the shame and the guilt and the anxiety and all of the kind of negative emotional responses that a person may have had. You're kind of really put in a position where you have to confront it. And the challenge is making sure that you're in a space in which you feel safe enough to explore those things. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this later, but the importance of having kind of culturally competent therapists and providers who can make you feel safe enough to really go there is so important. So the therapy piece is just as important as the drug. It's not some magical pill that's going to wipe all of your pain away. No, what happens is you take this medicine and you have to do the work, right? You have to be prepared to come and process and work through these difficult emotions and experiences, and then try to make sense of how you experience that on your trip. And then afterwards, even in kind of the follow-up sessions, you're kind of trying to integrate those experiences. Okay, so now that I've confronted this pain, maybe I feel a little bit better about it. And now how do I move forward with my life now that I feel a sense of liberation in this way? Now this is new. How do I move forward, right? So it's a lot of emotional processing work that participants have to do, and it's really important for your own healing to take place.
Yeah. And they can't forget the therapy part of it. It sounds like a lot of hard work,
Yeah.
and it is. Therapy is a lot of hard work, and
Yes.
you both there as therapists are really there to guide and to help and to integrate and make them feel safe so that that hard work can actually happen.
Yeah.
The drug is just an adjunct or an add-on to accelerate that process. Did I get that right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. And you hinted at it when you talked about the cultural competence of the therapist, but I know you both do wonderful work as well on perceptions of psychedelics in diverse communities. So can you speak more about that work?
Sure. So that's such a huge question because I honestly feel that all the work that I do is really kind of coming from uh, a kind of a particular lens. I guess kind of summarize it, we would call it a Jedi lens. You might be hearing that term more in the field. Stands for kind of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So kind of having this kind of Jedi lens and this kind of social activism that really informs the work that I do. I'm constantly focusing on equity for everybody, right? I'm thinking about kind of how to use critical theory to really affect change, not just in an organizational level, but at a systematic level. I'm thinking about how to create opportunities for access, right? Broadly in research participation, we see tons and tons of studies show that people of color are minimally represented in in research in general, but
Across the
especially in
board.
psychedelics specifically.
Mhm.
Not to mention that therapists of color are minimally represented in the field of psychedelic science. Um, so for me, it's important to kind of increase opportunities to access this kind of material, this kind of this gem that we have. Honestly, I really believe in the potential of psychedelics to transform and really radicalize and evolutionize the way we understand kind of psychiatry and psychology and mental health treatment broadly. So I feel privileged as someone who is educated and has access to these resources and to this information. And it's now my job to make sure that I'm disseminating this information as directly and as succinctly and as clearly as possible so that people know that it exists, so that they know that opportunities exist, that they have the potential to be healed and to be free from the pain and the trauma that they've suffered, or the addiction or the anxiety or the you name it that they've suffered with for so long. So that kind of is what moves me. That's what informs the research that I do, the kind of statistical analysis that I do, the way I design my studies, how I write my protocol, how I approach the institutional review board to try and get a study passed, right? Is how can I make this accessible to people who are otherwise marginalized and would otherwise not have access to this, right? And so with that also comes the importance of education, right? And kind of making sure that I am educated and up to date. Because a lot of people think like, oh, just because you're a person of color, you just inherently have this knowledge about how to be, an advocate for marginalized groups, or that you automatically know how to be culturally competent. And that is the furthest thing from the truth. We have to work too. We have to read too. We have to write and process too, right? We have to be educated as well. So for me, I take that personally so that I'm doing the work. I'm then modeling what that work process can look like for potential research participants, for potential collaborators. So just really emphasizing the importance of education in that way, so that I can answer the tough questions that comes when you work with communities of color who typically don't feel safe to ask honest questions, right? Who are kind of coming from a context in which there's a long legacy of medical mistrust and pain and harm and discrimination,
Yeah.
right? And then I'm asking you to come do some psychedelics in a clinical drug trial. It's like, what are you talking about? Right? So I have to I have to be knowledgeable and aware of the breadth of what might come up so that I can inform them and help them to feel safe with me to do this work. So yeah, to sum it up, I would just say just being driven by this kind of social justice lens is really at the crux of everything that I do and everything that I hope to continue to do moving forward.
Whew. Yes, yes, yes. And to jump in the conversation here, just around culturally responsible care, it feels important to define what I mean when I say culturally responsible care. And to me, when I think about culturally responsible care, it's a practice. So it's not something that you can get a certificate in and be deemed culturally competent. It is something that is ongoing, that happens not just with the information that you receive here, but also the work that you do here. And so it's taking into consideration a person's race, gender, ability, income, education, geography, and how all of these social factors contribute to the way that symptoms present or
Yeah.
manifests in particular groups, as well as what are the clinical outcomes for a person that fits this particular demographic? Because if we're not taking all of these social factors into consideration, there's a direct impact on clinical outcomes. So, for example, what does this mean? How do we translate that knowing into practice? So, research shows that folks from BIPOC communities are more likely to express psychological symptoms as physical symptoms. And for one reason is there's less of a distinction between mind body. And another reason is that there's less of a stigma associated with complaining of physical symptoms as there is if complaining of mental symptoms. So I feel like as clinicians, as therapists, as researchers, how do we take this knowledge and complete assessments or complete screening that's really culturally competent, taking into factors like that. And to me, culturally responsible care also extends beyond a racialized lens. So to illustrate what I mean by that, in the psychedelic medicine field, you've got folks, for example, who haven't engaged in medicine work at all, who are psychedelic naive, and who just hear about the work and are wanting to engage in treatment. And as therapists, as clinicians, as researchers, it's important for us to think about how does the container shift, or how is it different in the preparatory period for someone who hasn't had experience with psychedelics versus someone who maybe identifies as a psychonaut and has had prior experience.
I love that term, by the way, psychonaut.
Yeah, and even with what was I gonna say? Folks in the
I threw
field.
you off. I'm sorry.
Nope, it's all good. It's gonna come back. It's gonna come back. Cycle. Oh yes. So preparatory period. Um, Oh, yes. And like Mila was saying earlier, just around education, the importance of education throughout the process, that education in that preparatory period might look different for folks of color, for folks who haven't had prior psychedelic experiences, just so they can fully know what they're consenting to, what type of experience they could have. And it also feels important to mention, and will be hopefully one of the last things I say about, which is around just the journey of the experience. Because I feel like a lot of what's talked about in the mainstream about psychedelic therapy is like, you've got to go back to like these really hard places, these difficult places in your life, these challenges that have happened to you, these harms that have happened to you. And while that might be true, what is also true is there can be joy as part of the experience. There can be peace as part of the experience. There can be relaxation as part of the experience. And that feels important to love, exactly, as part of the experience, that all these kind of like by these polarizing parts of like the challenging experiences, but also the expansive experiences, they do coexist and can coexist within this therapy.
So cool.
So
I'm
glad to
learning
hear about
so
that.
much. I learned Jedi, I learned Psychonaut. I selfishly, this is why I love having a podcast, because I get to bring awesome people like you both in and learn about cool things that I've never thought about before, like the work you are doing. And there's so much about psychedelics, as we mentioned in the beginning, but I don't think a lot of folks have thought about the things that you are bringing up. And I think this is such an important message. I did want to ask you, because I know our audience is going to be wondering about this. How can they find out more? How can they get involved in something like this? What resources are available if people want to learn more about this? You're like, you
I'll
go,
start
you
us
go.
off. I'll start us off. So, the ketamine assisted psychotherapy is a legal science-based treatment dependent on the clinic and the location that is available to folks now. And there are all kinds of ketamine therapy clinics that are across the country. Going to do a shameless plug for my company, Mind's Eye Health Solutions. And we've got, or we're starting ketamine therapy here in Kentucky. So for folks who are interested in learning more about that service, they can visit us at www.minds.health.com, and we can continue the conversation about ketamine therapy there. For folks who are interested in enrolling in clinical research trials, clinicaltrials.gov is really going to be the main place where folks can go and type in like MDMA therapy, psilocybin therapy to see what studies are available to them. It also can include inclusion and exclusion criteria, so you already know what's going on. And for folks who are therapists, clinicians, researchers who are wanting to get involved in the field, particularly with MDMA therapy, they can go to maps.org/research, where there will be a few studies that are listed, MDMA therapy being one of the research studies, where they can learn more about how to become a therapist and find out more information about the research work.
Those are all incredible resources. Two things I'll name, or maybe three, that I'll name, is that Sarah talked about kind of the MDMA research that's going on. I have to mention we are preparing for expanded access in the field of psychedelic science. So MAPS sponsored clinical trials are entering a phase in which more people will have the ability to enroll. So the clinic that I'm a part of is in Tallinn, Connecticut. It's called Behavioral Wellness. There will be, hopefully we'll be kicking off, I don't want to say exactly when, but top of 2022. If you want to find us online and be connected with us, for folks who have treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress symptoms specifically, that kind of study will be available to you. You might be eligible. But for other folks who might just want to learn more, I wanted to mention the Ancestors Project, which does really incredible work around kind of the importance of honoring our ancestors and those who came before us, and kind of tilling the land and tilling the work and building the legacy, that kind of thing, in this work and beyond. There's also the Psychedelic Integration Collective, which is just a great resource for kind of understanding kind of what's happening in the field. Oh, and that reminds me, Chacruna. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Chacruna, CHACRUNA. Chacruna is an incredible hub for all things psychedelic, kind of covering a number of topics related to psychedelics, like sexual abuse and trauma, religion and spirituality. The list goes on and on. So Chacruna is awesome because there are always discussions going on, web events going on, articles being published. There's opportunities to get involved in kind of some of the social activism pieces of it as well, if you're interested in kind of policy changes as well. And then, sorry, I guess I had a lot more to say than I thought. And then I want to turn your attention to a place called One Village Healing. they're housed in New Haven, but they have some really incredible resources online, kind of just really existing at this intersection of like arts and creativity, healing and justice. So kind of getting back to my points about the importance of justice and advocacy and action. They do incredible work around kind of understanding how to heal in a creative context, but also kind of how to express whatever you might be feeling in a kind of activism, kind of grassroots way. So those are some great resources that you can check out. Of course, you can always reach out to me and Sarah, I'm sure, directly. If you have questions, we'd be happy to hear from you and to support you. And
that was wonderful. And I will list as many resources as I can in the bio to the podcast, and I'll get that list from you both. I want to thank you both so much for coming on the podcast and for all of the wonderful work that you're doing. Keep up the good work, and I'm so excited to see what you both do next. All right. Hi, Jessica. Very nice to meet you finally. I'm really excited to talk to you. Do you want to just introduce yourself briefly for the tape?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I'm Jess Maples-Keller. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Emory University School of Medicine. I'm the Associate Director of Research at the Emory Healthcare Veterans Program, which is a program that provides treatment for invisible wounds of war for post 9/11 veterans. That's led by Dr. Barbara Rothbaum and Dr. Sheila Rausch. I'm also a core investigator with the Grady Trauma Project, which is a group of investigators that research civilian trauma based out of Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia.
Awesome. And I've toured Grady. It's a very interesting location. So very glad to have you and get into some of your research. I know you do a lot of different types of research, but today we're talking about psychedelics. And we just heard from Sarah and Jamila about some of the history of psychedelics and how we got here. So I was thinking we could just start with you introducing what are the major types of psychedelics, how do they work?
Awesome, will do. And glad you were able to talk to Sarah and Jamila. They're so fantastic. So as far as, so psychedelics kind of generally describe this category of drugs or medicines that are associated with what we call non-ordinary states of consciousness. So this can mean different things, and people's subjective experience of them vary, even within the same medicine. But often it can involve things like changes in perception, mood, and cognition. It can alter people's sense of time. Their sense of themselves can involve things like experiencing hallucinations. Some people report experiencing like religious or spiritual or mystical experiences with some of these. So as far as kind of classification, I want to first acknowledge there's a lot of different views out there on how to classify these drugs. So there's not really like a really agreed upon taxonomy, but I'll give a brief overview about some of the terms that are often used. So when we talk about psychedelics, there's the classic psychedelics, things like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, or mescaline, and these are serotonin 2A receptor agonists. And so this is, when people say psychedelics, this is most usually the type of medicines that they're referring to. And then you also have a group called, some people call it empathogens. So these are drugs like MDMA that are mixed serotonin reuptake inhibitors and releasers. So there's some disagreement. Some people consider MDMA psychedelic, some people don't. And then you have atypical psychedelics, things like ibogaine, which affect multiple neurotransmitter systems. But so my research is mostly focused on MDMA and psilocybin, but there are many other kind of medicines that are currently being looked at for different uses within mental health treatment.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think people will be surprised to hear that scientists often disagree about things like how to classify.
Exactly.
different medications.
Exactly. A
So
lot of disagreement out there. Mhm.
yeah, thanks for laying that out though. And I think the serotonin system is most familiar to people. So
Yep.
they'll connect on that with like antidepressants. But I think it's good to like lay that groundwork and show that these all, for the most part, work on that system.
Yep,
So
definitely.
before we get into like the clinical implications, I wanted to talk about the legal status, which is something we can't ignore without,
Mhm.
in having this conversation. And this really gets into some of the treatment implications, which we'll get to soon. So can you discuss what's happening on the legal front with these drugs, and how does that impact research?
Definitely. So I can go into like a little bit of the history and current context, but I want to make sure it's clear I'm focused on kind of in the U.S. and within medical research because, as I'm guessing you both talked about earlier, these medicines have been used historically and currently across many different cultures for cultural ceremonies, religious ceremonies, spiritual ceremonies, or for healing. And often that gets kind of under acknowledged by the Western research community. So there's definitely a long history there. But as far as within the US and medical research, what we saw historically, starting in about the 1950s to the 1980s, there was this big kind of wave of psychedelic medical research and a lot of enthusiasm around combining psychedelics with therapy, given their potential therapeutic healing power. And at this time, they were not controlled substances. So what this meant was there was no regulations in their use. So there was a lot of interesting things done, some research done that was not very well controlled, even some unethical research occurred. So there's a lot of different examples of things that happened around this time frame. But one example is there was a CIA secret project called MK Ultra, where people were administered really high doses of LSD. Sometimes without their knowledge or consent. So there was lots of different types of research going on at this time. In the 60s, there was also this kind of rise in recreational use of the medicines. And there was also this kind of shift in public opinion on these medicines. So around this time, psychedelic drugs were designated a Schedule I substance. So generally what that means is the government designated that they have no medical value. So LSD and psilocybin received this designation in 1970, and MDMA received it in 1985. So this led to most government research kind of ending into their therapeutic value. So then starting in the 90s, you see a handful of scientists in the US and Europe reinitiated some human studies with psychedelics. And more recently, there's been a really big increase. So, you see things like the New York Times calling it the Psychedelic Renaissance, and a lot of different news coverage or TV shows talking about them. And a big part of that was the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Study, has been really focused on MDMA specifically in combination with PTSD therapy. And so they've been doing this work for a while. And in 2017, there was this really exciting change where based on MAPS clinical trials results showing the promise of MDMA assisted therapy for helping with PTSD, the FDA gave MDMA breakthrough therapy designation. So suggesting strong promise for not only its safety, but kind of efficacy for helping with PTSD symptoms. So this was a really kind of big moment in the field, and that really expedited their phase 3 trials and puts it on a potential path for FDA approval, which could even possibly happen in the next 2 years.
Oh, wow.
So we're in the midst of a lot of big changes. Currently, there's a lot more research going on, but of course it is still very regulated, given that it still is a Schedule I substance. But I think there's going to be a lot of changes over the next couple of years in the field and how research as well as therapeutic practice with these medicines look.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's, I'm a little biased, but a little a really exciting time to be in psychiatry, and especially in your field, because there's so much, as you're
Yes.
saying, movement in this area after it being so dormant for so long. And it's kind of interesting to look at like cannabis as one example where, you know, it's on a similar trajectory. It's a little bit further along where public opinion has really changed, and we're really
Absolutely.
beginning to explore the medical applications of those substances. But I think like the take-home message is that it's still Schedule 1, so it's federally illegal, but it is being, you know, looked at in terms of all these medical indications. So hold tight and wait for those
Absolutely.
rigorous
Yes.
trials
Hold
to be
tight.
done.
And I totally agree. It's such an exciting time in research. There's a quote I really like because I definitely do believe there's like a lot of therapeutic potential here, but it also is such an exciting time for research when you think about like these are medicines that can tell us a lot kind of even more broadly about like what is consciousness, what is the
Yeah.
mind, what is the self. So I think there's a quote by Stan Grave that he said something like psychedelics used responsibly and with caution would be for psychiatry what the microscope is to biology or telescope for astronomy. And I just always love that quote because it really is an exciting way to be able to look at, you know, how we can help people with these difficulties and like what's really going on with our experience
Yeah,
of the
how do we
world.
understand the brain and how it functions at a basic level too? That's a really good point. Yeah,
Yep.
there's so much potential here, but I think people need to hold tight and wait for the really rigorous trials to be done so we can actually understand and really direct folks. So what types of things, you mentioned PTSD is one area of active investigation. What other areas are being explored in terms of clinical applications for psychedelics?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot, and there's more kind of almost every day, it feels like. So there's definitely a reason this is being called the Psychedelic Renaissance. So some areas include things like drug and alcohol addiction, depression, particularly treatment-resistant depression, terminal illness, end-of-life anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. With MDMA, there's also some work going on around couples therapy. So there's a lot of different areas. It's always expanding. I would say two of the most currently robust areas of like clinical trial research would be psilocybin, focused on mostly treatment-resistant depression, and MDMA for PTSD. But there's a lot of different applications kind of growing all the time. And then there's also a lot of great research coming out that isn't as focused on the mental health treatment, but really looking at the subjective effects and, like you said, things like brain function. So like what's going on when people are taking these medicines actually neurobiologically, and how does that associate with these effects they experience?
And that's so exciting. How about things like ketamine for depression? I know that's not one of the ones that you mentioned, but also like microdosing.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on with ketamine. So some people think of ketamine as a psychedelic, some don't. Ketamine does have FDA approval. So there's actually a lot of clinics now. There's not only a lot of research going on with ketamine, but it's also, integrated into clinical practice in a lot of areas and accessible to a lot of people for treatment. As far as microdosing, it's interesting. So there's a good bit of research on like what are the effects of microdosing in recreational users and kind of like descriptive research. I wanted to mention, because I come across this a lot of a misconception, that a lot of the main clinical trials with psychedelics are looking at full doses. So some people assume that like the trials are looking at more microdoses. And so most of the main ones are looking at, a full active dose of things like MDMA or psilocybin. But there is some interesting work going on looking at, given that there is a good bit of interest recreationally in things like microdosing, looking at when people engage in those sorts of habits, what sort of things do they experience, as well as kind of digging into what are the effects versus the placebo effects of doing things like microdosing psychedelics.
Okay. Yeah, and you mean microdosing just not to get that full psychedelic effect. So anything that's a smaller dose, although I think the doses we're talking about are very small anyways for like a full psychedelic experience, right?
Yeah, right. And that's the tricky thing too, is like, what is a microdose? Like there's not an agreed upon scientific definition. And there definitely have been within the main clinical trials, like dose comparison studies to look at, because, often when we're doing these sorts of trials, we're wanting to see what's the lowest dose you can take, but still get the maximal effect in order to minimize things like potential side effect or safety concerns. But yeah, a lot of the main trials and the main effects have been found for what we would call like active doses of the medicines, again, in combination with therapy.
Gotcha. Okay. So
Mhm.
much more we need to learn. Can you
Yes, a lot to learn.
can you go into what like psychedelic assisted therapy looks like, let's say for your work with MDMA and PTSD? Like give us a picture of what like a clinical trial would look like.
Yeah. So, there are obviously differences across different trials or protocols, but many use a similar general format. And the stages of what that looks like is, first, there's always that kind of evaluation and assessment phase where people are assessed in order to determine, are you an appropriate candidate for psychedelic assisted therapy? And the eligibility is typically pretty stringent. So making sure that both medically and psychologically that the person would be a good candidate. So it often involves, like a full medical exam, medical workup, things like an EKG for MDMA, full psychiatric assessment and historical assessment. Often these trials involve tapering of SSRI medications. So as we talked about a little bit ago, these serotonergic systems are really important to the effects of these medicines. And some of the MAPS data suggests that recent exposure to antidepressants that target reuptake transporters may reduce the effectiveness of MDMA-assisted therapy. So often there's a tapering period for people who are on SSRI medications. And then for those that are eligible and a good fit for the treatment, the first step of the actual treatment involves what we call preparation. So these are multiple therapy sessions with your main therapist that involve, providing guidance on what to expect during the dosing session, developing rapport and a good relationship with the therapist, practicing some skills in case, some coping strategies are needed during the dosing day, and really helping the person prepare emotionally for their psychedelic experience. So then the psychedelic day itself, whether that's MDMA or psilocybin, it's typically a full day, given that the effects do last for several hours, so usually at least 6 to 8 hours. And for most protocols, you're in the room with two therapists. You're laying in a bed. A lot of times there's a music playlist playing, and eye shades are provided. So most protocols encourage people to spend a good bit of that day inward, kind of really tuning into their experience and what comes up for them. But both the therapists are available the entire day to kind of help support and just kind of be there for the person, however that's needed. So, and then after the actual dosing day, and different protocols are different. Sometimes there's one, sometimes there's 1 to 2 to 3 of those dosing days. But after that phase of treatment, there's what we call integration. So this is usually multiple therapy sessions after the dosing session, where the participant processes their experience and processes insights, talks about how to apply them to their life with the support of their therapist. So that's kind of a general overview about what it typically looks like.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And most of these trials, is there like a placebo group, so they would come in and not know that they're not given the active drug, and even the therapist wouldn't know? Is that right?
Yeah, so it's done different ways, but often there's a placebo. So for some trials, there's been like crossover, so where you have 2 sessions, and one day's an MDMA day, one day's a placebo day, but the therapist and the participant don't know which is which. Obviously, blinding and placebos are a little tricky when you have these medicines that have such significant subjective effects.
Right.
But actually, the data suggests people aren't 100% accurate in predicting what they got.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then some trials. So for instance, one of the main large psilocybin trials going on, it's a dose comparison, but one of the 3 doses is, typically not associated with active effects. So you don't know exactly what dose you got. And neither does the therapist, but there is, there's a lot of individual level variability about how much subjective effects people feel with different doses. So it's often not clear what people receive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So then you guys on the back end as researchers, you can test whether the effects are above placebo or above different doses. So kind of finding what the best dose is to maximize whatever outcome you're measuring.
Exactly. So yeah, hopefully maximizing the therapeutic benefit while minimizing the side effects experienced by the participants.
Very cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing all the results. Do you have any like initial findings you can share about like positive effects or any side effects experienced in these patients?
So as far as our work, the trial we just completed was in healthy adults, so it wasn't a therapeutic trial. And then I'm the therapist on the Compass psilocybin trial. So those results, the trial has wrapped up and we're waiting on the results. So I'm just as eager to hear as everyone else how those results look, but it should be soon that those results come out.
Very cool. Is there anything you can share about like what patients have reported to you or just like what you've observed, in the patients who have done it?
It's a really interesting experience as a therapist, as you can imagine. Yeah, people definitely have really different experiences. But yeah, I definitely do see a lot of healing potential in these medicines. I think, again, we have I'm glad there's a lot of rigorous, high quality research going on right now so that we can make sure it's done safely and we can figure out what's really going on. But I think there's, in my experience with actually doing the clinical work, I think there's so much potential here. So I'm really thrilled to see what happens over the next few years as we learn more and more. And I think importantly, learn about like, what are the parts that are really important to people actually getting better? There's a lot going on neurobiologically, there's a lot going on therapeutically. So hopefully over time, we can more and more hone in on like, what are the pieces that really matter and how can we most effectively get that to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. And you're thinking right now that the goal would be to just, do one of these sessions. Like, what is the frequency? Is it kind of like one and done, or are we thinking repeated?
That's a great question. And I think, again, like to be determined. I think it would be, just feasibility wise, it would be wonderful if one session within a therapeutic protocol would be sufficient. But I think that's up in the air if that's going to be enough. But I will say one thing that I find so exciting about the data so far is in the MAPS data, there hasn't been, a lot of long-term follow-up given that this research is pretty new. So MAPS has a long-term follow-up study of participants who did the MDMA therapy for PTSD. And over long-term follow-up, not only were gains on average maintained, but they even increased. Oh, wow. So it's something like that makes me so excited as a psychologist to think that like, these aren't just like one-off experiences that people enjoy, but then it kind of fizzles off, that at least for a good bit of people that this really sustains over time and can be really transformative for people. But I think it's a good question. And I think it'll be interesting as different models are explored to see, not only how many dosing sessions do people need, but also how much preparation and integration do people need? And maybe is there individual level differences on like, some people might need more, maybe you don't need an extra dosing session, but maybe you need some extra integration sessions or follow-up to kind of help maintain your gains. But I think, there's again, a lot left to learn.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot to be hopeful about too, because I think it's so different from what we're seeing in other types of treatments for mental disorders where you need to take a medication basically for the rest of your life, or, therapy is great and it works, but sometimes you need maintenance therapy and you need to stick with it. So what are you, I guess, most excited about on this front in terms of the research or the actual potential of the treatment?
Yeah, I think you just really hit the nail on the head with that. I think it's really, we see a lot of people, like some people are hesitant about psychedelics. And I think it's interesting if you kind of take an objective lens comparing psychedelics with current psychiatric medication practice, like you're saying, often it involves people taking the medication or multiple medications every day for years on end. There are significant side effect profiles with medications that are prescribed really regularly. So just to echo what you already said, I think it's just so amazing to see that a lot of trials are showing good effects with these 1 or 2 times administration. So I think a really something I'm really excited to see is how we're able to expand access to these treatments over time, both legally and how we're able to roll them out and get them to people. And it's a pretty significant time commitment often. So how we help people actually integrate that into their lives. But I think it's, a really exciting time to figure those things out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have a couple extra minutes. We flew through all the questions I had prepared. So if it's okay with you, I want to ask you one more question. You're like, what is she going to ask? I wanted to, this is obviously a brain podcast. So I wanted to know if you had any ideas about how these affect the brain, how this could be working at a therapeutic level, and feel free to take that in whatever direction you want.
Yeah. So, in our work, we have been looking at MDMA and its impact on fear extinction. So I think that's an area that could be really exciting to look at, both the psychophysiology and eventually looking at neurobiologically. So there's been some really cool research by Young and colleagues looking at how MDMA impacts fear extinction and fear extinction retention in rodent models. So that was kind of the basis of our healthy adult study, was looking at if that finding also occurs in healthy adults as kind of a foundation to looking at it in the context of the type of treatment that we do, which is prolonged exposure therapy for PTSD. So I think, looking at the kind of known neurobiological processes of fear extinction could be a really cool way to look at how brain changes might predict or be associated with some of these treatment mechanisms. So that's the kind of main area that I'm also interested in generally, as I said, the research that some other people are doing, looking at, brain changes with administration of these medicines and what pieces seem to be really important to both the therapeutic and just the subjective effects. So, people experience really different subjective effects on these medicines. So trying to figure out what's going on and what's going on with some of the variability.
Yeah, and that
there.
area sounds just wide open. We have very little understanding of how these compounds actually work on both of those fronts. So I think there's a lot to do there. And I'm glad you mentioned fear extinction. And I think we had Tanya Jovanovic on for the PTSD episode, so I think folks will remember that. But at least for PTSD, that makes a lot of sense to focus on that as kind of a process that we know is impaired in PTSD. So can psychedelics actually get at that? Really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're really excited to keep following up on this line of work.
I'm excited too. I'm going to have to get you back on in a couple of years to see how things have changed. It sounds like it's going to be
there'll probably
totally
be
different.
A lot to catch up on.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
So I guess to end, what do you recommend for folks who are interested in learning more about this, or someone who might have PTSD or wants to try something like this?
Yeah, great question. So, as I've said, MAPS has a lot of ongoing trials, so you can check out their website and see if you might be a fit or if there's a study in your area. One thing I also always like to give a plug in is that, especially, I think there's so much excitement around psychedelic assisted therapy, which is wonderful. But the reality is it's not available most places, and there's pretty strict inclusion criteria. So for, some random medical reason, someone might not be eligible. So I always like to just give a plug to that. There is really great evidence-based PTSD therapy that exists now that, doesn't have those inclusions, that's more widely accessible and is available in most places. So things like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy. So looking for cognitive behavioral therapies for PTSD for anyone looking for some help. We know that those are very effective for treating PTSD and are much more widely available. So I like to always emphasize that for any post 9/11 veterans out there. I'll put a plug in for the Emory Healthcare Veterans Program. We provide prolonged exposure free of therapy and other psychotherapies. And then as far as just learning more about this generally, I think, there's a lot of great readings out there. So digging into the scientific literature, and, these have been used across many different cultures. So reading more broadly, as well as the MAPS website has a really great psychedelic bibliography that people can check out, and some great videos on psychedelics, as well as a lot of really cool work on policy and advocacy in this area, because I think that's also so important right now as things are shifting so much legally. They've been doing a lot of great work
those
there.
are wonderful. And I'll include some of those links in the bio to this podcast. I also want to plug in the Michael Pollan book. I thought he did a wonderful job in covering this area, and he actually experimented with some himself. So I think that's a really good read for anyone who's interested. And you're exactly right about therapy being widely available, and that does have a really great evidence base. We know it works. I always recommend people go to psychologytoday.com. They have a really great website where you can actually search for a therapist who would specialize in PTSD or cognitive processing or prolonged exposure, and actually find someone in your area who takes your insurance and does that. So we can link to that.
Yes, definitely. Great recommendation. Yes. And having those search terms can be helpful. I think the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies also has a similar kind of search directory, and Anxiety and Depression Association of America are just two other ones where there'd be likely to be a lot of providers with expertise in this area. So yeah, there's great PTSD therapy options out there without psychedelics too. So want to encourage people to
While we're waiting for that, that's wonderful. And thank you so much, Jessica. I really appreciate you being here. This was so fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Thank you. I want to thank Wayne Radio for having us and recording my audio. So thanks so much. That wraps up another episode of the BrainSTEM podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and share this with friends and family, and be sure to follow us on social media at BrainSTEM Podcast.